Hi, my name is Mistress Harley, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a queer professional dominatrix. I love the horror genre, and I feel drawn to it because it always explores aspects of the taboo. It's usually some kind of taboo feelings that are driving the killer or even the people being murdered. It's always something about a secret or something terrible. There's so many different paths of darkness to explore in the horror genre. When I see myself explicitly represented in horror, it's always as the femme fatale, or the more wise, older, experienced woman who's grooming a younger woman into the initiation and rites of whatever nasty, shady thing is going on. As a queer dominatrix, when I see characters like myself in horror movies, they almost always survive to the end because they're almost always the ones killing, seducing, and torturing people. My favorite queer horror movie that's an absolute must-watch is Daughters of Darkness. It's about a vampire lady who's camped out in a castle or hotel in the mountains, and a young couple appears, and slowly over time the vampire lady seduces and entices the female half of the couple until they kill all the men. What makes a horror film queer? That's the inclusion of queer characters, or sometimes queer coding, which means you don't explicitly say the characters are gay, lesbian, trans, etc., but there are little tells and little giveaways. Sometimes those things aren't even explicitly intended by the writers, directors, or actors, but we as queer people see them and pick up on them, and those films become queer films. Daughters of Darkness is obviously a queer horror movie because a lady vampire seduces another woman and then they kill all the men that the women are related to. And even though there isn't like a lot of overt queer sex scenes, it's very obvious that these two women are having a romantic relationship. Obviously, Sleepaway Camp is one of the most famous queer horror movies because, spoiler alert, at the end we find out that the killer is actually trans. Although maybe not trans by their own desires, but trans by the desires of their parents. In some ways it's a cliche where the killer is queer and having to take out their aggression on all the people around them, but it is an unmistakable inclusion of a trans character in a horror movie. I would also include Black Swan as a queer horror movie because there is a scene where the protagonist has a lesbian sexual fantasy that may or may not have actually occurred, but as the character starts to get into the depths of her own neuroses and of her own mind as she envelops this character that is the Black Swan, she's also starting to explore deeper parts of her sexuality and her darker desires. One of my favorite queer horror movies is Interview with a Vampire. It's more queer-coded than actually overtly gay, but the way all the male vampires interact with each other, kiss each other, bite each other's necks, and of course the vampire is an unmistakably sexual creature in horror movies. So as all those like hot, attractive men interact with each other, I think that the queer community has claimed Interview with a Vampire as a queer film. Obviously, the Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of the most famous cult queer films. There's even a song sung by Tim Curry in drag called "I'm a Sweet Transvestite from Transsexual Transylvania." It's one of the great queer films because the antagonist of the film and the person that we identified with the most is also the openly gayest, and it's pretty fabulous. Silence of the Lambs is another queer horror film that comes to mind, in part because of the terrible trope of Buffalo Bill being a mentally unbalanced transvestite, transsexual, transgendered person. It's not really clear how Buffalo Bill identifies, but obviously he has to cut the skin off of women to wear them to fulfill his fantasy of being a woman. I hate this depiction of trans people in film, and I feel like it's a trope that gets carried forward over and over and over again, where somehow because you're trans, you're also mentally unbalanced and maybe you kill people. This is why they don't want to let trans people in bathrooms, and it's wrong. In horror movies, queer people often find themselves identifying with the monster or the killer because that's usually the person that has a secret. That's usually a person that has been marginalized, tortured, or bullied into becoming the monster. And I think everyone that has lived through a queer experience can also relate to this idea that being pushed and pushed and pushed and forced to deny your own identity can create a terrible, terrible psychosis and a terrible monster. It's really the queer people that are never bullied that live the most normal lives. Though there are types of queer representation that are more common, like Buffalo Bill as a tortured trans killer, or even in Sleepaway Camp, a tortured trans killer, I also think that it's very common to see like sexy lesbians in horror, because that's just the easiest way to get boobs on a screen and a male audience titillated. But the kind of queerness that's still really taboo in the horror genre is asexual people that keep their clothes on. Anyone that's well adjusted and happy living their gay life, where being gay or queer or trans is just a side note to the life of the character instead of this linchpin that gives away something or creates plot. For most of us in our lives, being queer isn't a major plot point. It's actually just an overlay of the experience that we're having. These days, we often see homophobia portrayed in film, although more recently it's kind of as a morality tale of the bad guys. The bad guys are playing smear the queer, the bad guys are beating up the guy they perceive to be gay. We even saw this in the newest remake of It, in It 2. The movie opens with a hate crime, and it's a little disturbing. It's more than disturbing because these things actually happen to people, but I find it interesting that that's something that was added to the It franchise. In the first It with Tim Curry, you never see any homophobia or queer language or queer characters, and maybe one of those characters is coded as queer, but that's really more up to the viewer than ever explicitly stated. These days we really see homophobia as a lesson of what not to do, only the jerks are doing it, but certainly in the past homophobia was so much more common, just as another plot point in a film. There are so many tropes of queer characters that we continue to see in horror over and over and over again. Just like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, it's a transvestite or transsexual who's tortured and has to become a killer, or Sleepaway Camp, where the trans person is a crazed killer because they've been forced into this position. We also often see the traditional effeminate males or masculine females to code those characters as queer, but in reality, there are a lot of feminine lesbians, there are a lot of very masculine gay men with giant beards. There are a lot of queer people living totally normal, happy lives. And that's the trope that we don't see, is where are happy queer families? Where are normal queer people who are just having horror happen to them? No, somehow they're always the killer, or they're tortured, or they have this big secret. Even in the most recent It 2, the queer character who's coded as queer never explicitly comes out as queer, has a big dirty secret that the clown is torturing him with. Why can't he just be out and proud and then the clown has nothing on him? The political climate always affects horror films, whether it's the Russian invasion during the Cold War or whether it's reefer madness of the 60s. Right now, in our modern times, we love zombie movies. The horror genre is oversaturated with zombies because we can't even deal with the reality of living with our corrupt government in our go-nowhere lives. And young people would rather think about killing their neighbors for food than think about living in a society that doesn't allow them to openly be themselves. In some ways, the horror genre is always reflective of the problems of society and shows us the dystopia that we're trying to either embrace or avoid. I think the AIDS epidemic impacted horror movies because everyone started to think about pandemic. Everyone started to think about viruses that were unstoppable, uncurable, and could kill everyone you know and love. A lot of people during the AIDS crisis lost close family members, lovers, partners that they had been with for years. And we see films coming along like Outbreak and other virus-oriented films. Even the zombie genre is full of these terrifying viruses that turn your loved ones into horrible, pus-filled, sickly monsters. In addition to those overt virus films, I would argue that films like Philadelphia are absolutely horror movies. The whole movie is about a man being slowly hunted and murdered by disease, and then all of his loved ones mourn him. The current state of queer horror is that queer people are starting to be not only included in films, but included in films in a way that are not the main plot points. I recently watched a movie called 420 Massacre, which I just thought was going to be a romp in the woods with pot-smoking murderers and a typical stoner flick, but it was actually about a group of lesbians going into the woods, and yeah, they all got murdered by these guys running a pot farm, but that was the subtext, and it wasn't even advertised that it was a lesbian movie, but it had a lot of these lesbian experiences. Women talking about their relationships, one gay girl who was in love with her straight friend forever and tries to hit on her, and it's weird, but it's fine, and then they get murdered. So the film is really about these crazed murderers in the woods and the weed, but there are just lesbians in it, and I want to see more of that in horror. I want to see more inclusivity, meaning that these characters are just out living their lives, going camping for their friend's birthday when the horror happens to them. Their gayness has nothing to do with why they get killed or why they're out in the woods. There's nothing related to the gayness except it's part of who they are, which is kind of how being queer really is. Horror always features a lot of violence against LGBTQ people. I mean, to be honest, horror films feature a lot of violence against everyone, but there is this trope with violence against gays, and homophobia isn't always an easy thing to tap into because it is easy to tap into in our society, unfortunately. In the new It Chapter 2 movie, the film opens up with homophobia and this hate crime that ends up killing one of the gay characters within the first 10 minutes of the film. And I think a lot of us who watched that movie felt like that was the real horror, because that's what's actually happening to gay people all over the world. And in some ways, if the It clown represents all these dirty little secrets and all these problems that we have with each other and ourselves and the things we worry about in our lives, I think that the film kind of reminds us that it would be easier to fight an alien space clown who's murdering all of our friends than it is to fight something as systemic in our society as homophobia. So while these characters can kill this murderous clown, there's no way they can stop gay guys from getting beat up at the carnival. The queer horror community is full of outcasts, weirdos, kinksters, and lovers of trashy pulp, and I include myself proudly in that group of people. I think it's so full of kinksters, adult performers, and porn lovers because there's a lot of overlap between the adult entertainment industry and the horror genre, and there always has been. Horror has almost been seen as kind of a dirty genre, just like pornography. Horror is also an easy genre to get into, and so a lot of adult actresses that are trying to leave porn behind them end up in the horror community, and then fans of horror are more than happy to embrace these girls that don't have their shirts on because they're used to seeing that in horror films all the time. Ultimately, the horror community is just a bunch of geeks, and queer geeks at that, because the people that watch horror films are also the people who are willing to examine the deep parts of their soul and the deep parts of their sexuality. Movies like Hellraiser, The Howling, I mean films that include kinksters and gay people and all kinds of deviant behavior inspire the people that engage in that deviant behavior to form a community. So, the queer horror community. So, what does the future of horror look like? I'm hoping for a gay Jason Voorhees. Or even better, gay summer camp, where the killer is straight and cis. Wouldn't that be a turnaround? No one would see that one coming. Currently, the biggest obstacles that stand in the way of queer horror films is that queer people are still being used in the most token manners. If it's not the gay trope or the gay best friend or the homophobia, it's a stereotypical gay guy who's like so effeminate, or the stereotypical butch chick who's a lesbian because she has a short haircut and wears men's pants. I just want to see more of actual representation in queer horror films, and hopefully as we progress as a society, we'll start seeing more characters in horror movies that are queer and not just coded queer, and that actually just have queer lives and are experiencing the horror around them.